Vernon Phillips Watkins. Welsh poet and translator. Born the 27th of June 1906, died the 8th of October 1967. Vernon Watkins was born in Maesteg in Glamorgan, and brought up mainly in Swansea. His birth coincided with slight earth tremors. Another baby born that night was christened John Earthquake Jones. His parents were William Watkins, a manager for Lloyd's Bank in Wine Street, Swansea, and Sarah, Sally. Sarah had a love of poetry and literature. Her headmistress arranged for her to spend 2 years as a pupil teacher in Germany. The family lived at Redcliffe, a large Victorian house about 4 miles (6.4 kilometers) from Swansea, at Caswell Bay. Vernon Watkins read fluently by the age of 4, and at 5 announced that he would be a poet, although he did not wish to be published until after his death. He wrote poetry and read widely from 8 or 9 years of age, and was especially fond of the works of John Keats and Shelley. He received his later education at a preparatory school in Sussex, Repton School in Derbyshire, and Magdalene College, Cambridge. In his early years at Repton, his quiet, gentle character caused him to be bullied by the old boys, though in his last years he attained more popularity as he was able to show capacity in tennis and cricket. After he died, in 1968, the school wrote that he was perhaps the best poet Repton has had. Despite his parents being nonconformists, Vernon's school experiences influenced him to join the Church of England. He read modern languages at Cambridge, but left before completing his degree. In 1935 he met Dylan Thomas, who was to be a close friend. Vernon Watkins had returned to a job in a bank in Swansea. About once a week Dylan Thomas would come to Vernon's parents' house. Vernon was the only person from whom Thomas took advice when writing poetry, and he was invariably the first to read his finished work. They remained lifelong friends, even though Dylan Thomas failed to turn up as Vernon's best man when Vernon and Gwen married in 1944. Vernon Watkins had met Gwen at Bletchley Park, where he worked during the Second World War as a cryptographer, and Gwen was a member of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. They were both engaged in breaking the Luftwaffe tactical codes. Gwen was at first billeted at Stony Stratford, but later moved to RAF Church Green at Bletchley. They were both flight sergeants at Bletchley from June 1942 until May 1945. They were married at the Church of St. Bartholomew the Great, in London on the 2nd of October 1944. Dylan Thomas used to laugh affectionately at his friend's gossamer-like personality and extreme sensibility. One evening in Chelsea, during the wartime blackout, they were walking along and Vernon tripped over something and fell to the ground. Dylan Thomas looked with a torch to see what made Vernon trip, and to his delight all that they could find was a small, black feather. Letters to Vernon Watkins by Dylan Thomas was published in 1957. The 1983 book Portrait of a Friend by Vernon Watkins' wife Gwen deals with the relationship. Others in the Swansea group known as the Cardoma Boys were the composer Daniel Jenkin Jones, writer Charles Fisher, and the artists Alfred Yanes and Mervyn Levi. Vernon wrote the obituary for Dylan Thomas. He became a major figure for the Anglo-Welsh poetry tradition, and his poems were included in major anthologies. During the Second World War, Vernon was for a time associated with the New Apocalyptics poetry group in the UK. With his first book Ballad of the Marie Lloyd, 1941, which was accepted by Faber and Faber, he had a publisher with a policy of sticking by their authors. They said of Vernon Watkins, "Mr. Watkins is undoubtedly a poet with an uncommon sense of rhythm as well as of imagery." The British Library holds a manuscript draft of the poem with annotations by T. S. Eliot, showing Eliot at work as editor and board member at the publishing house Faber, his day job since 1925. The library also holds the Watkins Papers, which include autograph and typewritten poems chiefly from his 7 published volumes, but also some unpublished poems. In 2016, another collection of Vernon Watkins's draft poems was acquired from Gwen Watkins. Vernon wrote poetry for several hours every night, and by way of contrast, Caitlin, Dylan Thomas's wife, could not recall her husband staying in even for one night during their whole married life. Vernon was familiar with Philip Larkin, whose affectionate recollection of him can be found in his required writing, Miscellaneous Pieces 1955 to 1982. He was awarded a University of Wales Honorary Doctorate of Literature in 1966, after retiring from his job at the bank. He was being considered for Poet Laureate at the time of his death. Vernon Watkins had developed a serious heart condition, which he made light of, and insisted on playing his beloved tennis and squash with his usual vigor. He died on the 8th of October 1967, aged 61, playing tennis in Seattle, where he had gone to teach a course on modern poetry at the University of Washington. His body was returned to Britain, and was buried in the Gower, at St. Mary's Church, Pennard. A small granite memorial to him stands at Hunts Bay, Gower, on which are inscribed 2 lines from his poem, Taliesin in Gower. I have been taught the script of stones, and I know the tongue of the wave. This video filmed near Pennard Community Hall shows the unveiling of a memorial stone to Vernon Watkins by his daughter Rhiannon Powell. A portrait of Vernon Watkins by his friend Alfred Yanes may be seen in the Glyn Vivian Art Gallery, Swansea. This BBC Radio Times front cover from October 1949 shows the Cardoma Boys. Dr. Rowan Williams, Archbishop of Canterbury, said this of Vernon Watkins.
Vernon Watkins is, in some ways, the antithesis of Dylan as a person and as a poet. As a person, he is this bank clerk who leads a blameless domestic life in Gower. As a poet, someone who's immensely rich and complex mythological framework of his writing, but all very, very strictly in a slightly Victorian idiom in some ways, so that people miss the depth of it. I think Watkins has almost as much of an ear at his best as Dylan has. So in the Ballad of the Mari Lwyd, the song-like quality, the close attention to sounds and how they work, the way in which you can shift the vowels or consonants of a phrase just a little bit to make a big change, very, very skillful.
In 2012, on the BBC Radio 3 programme Swansea's Other Poet, Dr. Rowan Williams, presented a portrait of Vernon Watkins and said Vernon Watkins was one of the 20th century's most brilliant and distinctive yet unjustly neglected voice. In October 2014, Swansea Council unveiled a blue plaque for Watkins outside the building on the corner of St. Helens Road and Beach Street in the city, where he spent 38 years working for Lloyds Bank. On the 3rd of November 2014, the Poem of the Week in The Guardian was Vernon Watkins' poem, 3 Harps. Most of Vernon Watkins's manuscripts are held by the National Library of Wales.